So trauma and traumatic loss. Trauma and traumatic loss affect most people at some point in their lives. It could be the death of a loved one, a natural disaster, or some other traumatic event. Chances are you and or someone you know has experienced either personal trauma or traumatic loss, or both. Working definition. Traumatic loss is any loss involving violence, suicide, homicide, witnessing a death, an accident that causes loss of life or loss of functionality, the death of a child, an illness or severe health crisis, a natural disaster, terrorism, or other similar act. Now remember, trauma occurs when a person's ability to cope is overwhelmed. Okay? The crisis is too big, it's too much, and they move into what we call a traumatic reaction or traumatic incident. So it's just too much. Normal is what normally works for them is absolutely not working. Absolutely not working at all. And so there's nothing they can access that's going to help them. And if that continues for very long, or if it's extremely deep, trauma occurs. Now they can recover from the trauma, or they can continue to suffer from the trauma. And that's more what we're going to talk about. We'll talk about it a little bit tonight, but we're going to talk about post-trauma distress in a couple of weeks. So when we take a look at the many stressful events of life, we can be faced with extraordinary circumstances that leave us feeling terrified, powerless, and or horrified in the face of threatened or actual injury or death. So some of the examples of traumatic events that we've talked about natural disaster. You have catastrophe, either by human error or by failed equipment. And remember, when we're talking about catastrophe, all right, this is something that is a disaster. It's immeasurable ruin. It's an enormous amount of damage and loss. Okay, but then we have physical or sexual assault, rape, robbery, mugging, but it can be something even like a serious motor vehicle accident. It's one thing to get into a fender bender, but it's another thing to wake up in an intensive care unit. We've all seen the shows with first responders on them where they're getting the jaws of life and they got life flight and all this. That's traumatic. Okay, that's normal has just completely gone out the window. We also have witnessing violence, witnessing injury to someone, or witnessing the death of someone. Of course, we have combat, consequences of war. There's torture, there's imprisonment, severe threat of harm, like stalking, something like that, or we have someone who's verbally abusive and verbally oppressive and make you feel threatened and unsafe all the time. That's traumatic. When we talk about domestic violence and physical abuse, but even witnessing that is traumatic. The person witnessing actually can feel more powerless than the person experiencing it, especially when we're dealing with children. Then you've got fire and burn survivors, significant, like destruction of your home, right? A hurricane comes through and picks your house up, turns it into kindling and scatters it across the county. And then life-threatening illnesses or even treatments. As a person has an illness and they're given an opportunity to enter into a treatment plan, but the treatment is going to be as devastating or more devastating than than the disease or the illness they're fighting. All of those things can be traumatic and much more. So traumatic loss is often described by those who've survived it as feeling surreal, which means it feels just really strange, weird, odd. It's like being in a fog, it must be a nightmare that we're going to wake up from. This can't be real. Okay. It's too horrible to even think about it. I don't even want to have to think about it. I'm going to wake up tomorrow and everything's going to be back to normal and everything's going to be fine. They just cannot get their mind around accepting, because it's too big, it's too much of a shock, it's too dark, it's too horrible. And that word too, that it's too much, excessive, that's when trauma can happen. Now the statistics tell us that over 80% of Americans will be exposed to a traumatic event and therefore may experience traumatic loss. About 9% of people exposed to a traumatic event or have traumatic loss may experience what the world calls post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. We call it post-trauma distress. Okay, so with the distress of the traumatic event continues on. As many as 35% of those directly exposed to mass disasters may develop post-trauma distress. And research has shown that human-made disasters are far more traumatizing than natural disasters. And terrorism is maybe the most destructive of all to the unpredictable and unrestrained nature. And it's very, very personal. We have to remember this. When we're attacked, when our person is attacked, we take it personally. We take it to heart. If something happens to our house, or if it's a tornado or a hurricane or a tidal wave or something like that, there wasn't a person involved. So taking it personally is at a minimum risk. But if you got a person involved, that feels like an assault on your personhood. And that's even more traumatic, because interpersonal trauma is far more damaging and far more significant than trauma that's experienced without that personal component. So how people respond to traumatic events varies. Some people are going to respond immediately, and sometimes there'll be a brief delay, and sometimes even an extended delay. I've known people that have been through traumatic events that are 3, 4, 5 months after the traumatic event where they start to manifest the symptoms, the after effects of the trauma, the intense feelings, the confusing thoughts, the nightmares, everything that goes with that. And not every person that experiences the same aftermath, not every person experiences the same aftermath of the same trauma. You can have 9 people go through you have 9 people go through the same traumatic event, and it completely impact them all completely differently. So, and just like with grief, people are very likely to bounce back and forth between periods when they relive the trauma and periods when they're emotionally numb and avoiding any thought. We'll talk about avoidance in a little bit. But they either are fully engaged in it, like it's fresh and just yesterday or even today. Other times when it's not even their life. And it's really normal for this to happen. And we have to remember that post-trauma distress can happen over a short period of time, like weeks or a few months. But if that doesn't reduce, but it seems to intensify, or there's no seemingly remedy or recovering from that, that's where the mental health industry calls it PTSD. The problem is, the reason we don't like that language is because it's not a disorder, right? A disorder means that you're stuck. Okay, this isn't a disorder, this is a malfunction. This is a survival mechanism that God built into us, this malfunctioning. Well, malfunction can be repaired. A disorder can't. A disorder now, then that becomes who you are. So we do not like to use that language. Okay, you're supposed to be freaked out when your house blows up. Okay, you're supposed to be freaked out when a child dies. You're supposed to be freaked out when your spouse is abducted. You're supposed to be freaked out when you lose a limb. So to be traumatized by that, and for that to have ongoing effect, is not a disorder. That's normal. The fact that it may continue when there's no real threat, or when there's a reminders, when it feels as if the same threat is there. I'll give you an example. Let's say you were a small child and you were attacked by a dog, and the dog chomped down on your face. Okay, you can be traumatized by seeing a dog, hearing a dog bark. Why? Because you haven't resolved and dealt with that traumatic event. You haven't healed that traumatic event yet. Even though this dog that you hear barking on TV is not a real threat. The problem with post-trauma distress is it's not connected to reality. It's connected to a real history, but not a real current event. And that's where it gets mixed up. Okay, but we have to understand that it takes a while to walk through this. I'm going to cover the next part on violence, and then I'm going to let Kelly talk about suicide. Violence. Whenever violence is done to someone, traumatic loss can occur. For instance, if rape happens, a person can experience the loss of their innocence and sense of safety. If a person is mugged or robbed, they can experience the loss of their sense of personal and physical safety. Both can lose a general belief or trust in humanity or even in God and his protection. And in both instances, trust has been deeply violated, and this can cause traumatic stress and trauma effects. A person, their sleep patterns can completely change. Their behaviors can go from extreme fear, not wanting to leave the house, buying a gun and a knife and mace and a dog and all of that. It can also result in some pretty significant physical effects. Headaches, loss of appetite, like we said, loss of sleep, loss of interest, all kinds of things can happen as a result. Okay, now we're going to talk about suicide. We're going to focus on suicide in another session. It's going to be all about suicide. So we're not going to get into a lot of the detail tonight. Okay. So, Kelly, you want to take that part?
Just some detail. Just kidding.
Yeah.
Like Warren said, we'll dig into it a little bit more in a few more lessons. So in 2015, some statistics, suicide was the 10th leading cause of death for Americans, according to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. In 2015, someone in the country died by suicide every 11.9 minutes. This is up from one every 13.7 minutes in 2010. According to 2015 data, the highest rate was among people 45 to 64 years of age. The second highest rate was among people 85 years and older. White males accounted for 7 of 10 suicides in 2015. And a common myth is that more suicides happen in December than any other month. This is not true. Suicide rates tend to be higher in the spring months, peaking into April. I can attest that that is true. If a family member has completed suicide, a member of that family is more likely to die of suicide as well. I've also witnessed that. Alaska has the highest per capita suicide rate in America. Why do you think that is?
Are you asking a question?
Yeah.
Because there's repetitive tasks, there doesn't seem to be any future in Alaska.
Okay.
It's no sunshine too.
hmm I think it's attributed to the days and days of sunshine, right? Having constant light, right? And then days and days of having, so there's no rhythm of the sun and the moon, right?
Right.
And our bodies aren't designed to be in that kind of
Right.
sun,
We live it. We
atmosphere.
live in cycles. We need the cycles, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's
That's my thought.
another factor with Alaska too, is that there's a lot of chemical abuse in Alaska because there's not much else to do to break the monotony for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. So gender, in 2015, men had a suicide rate of 19.9% per 100,000, while women had a rate of 5.2 per 100,000. Of those who died by suicide in 2015, 78.9% were male, while 21.1% were female. What women most often choose is an option where time counts. They'll usually take pills or slit their wrists, often telling someone what they're going to do so that they will be found in time. So kind of them. Men, however, are natural problem solvers, so they do the job to get it done. Men most often choose firearms or hanging. And
yeah, Kelly, can you kind of speak to that? Because on your tip calls, I know you're exposed to this quite a bit.
Yeah, it's very true. I've never been on a tip call for a female suicide. It's always been a male. And every one of the male suicides I've been on were hangings. So, yeah. It's very true and very sad. Trauma and overwhelm is absolutely, it's very interesting. And the other comment that was made that it happens in families. So if suicide's been introduced to the family, so if a brother commits suicide or completes suicide, another brother, because that's been open to the family, is more likely to have that as a suggestion, as a way out.
Hang on a second. So let's talk about this a little bit, because you and I do that often. We're really trying to help understand. We want to move away from the idea of commit suicide to complete suicide. Kelly, you want to address that as to why?
Well, you can talk about the Roman Catholic reason that committing suicide and all of the fine details of where that theology got started. So the reason that committing suicide even became language was because it was an early Roman Catholic, right? That if a death occurred, somebody has to be punished, right? So it's a committing of murder is how that began, right?
Well, yeah. So you've got homicide, which is the murder of a human, right? Homo sapien, if you will. But suicide is murder of self. And murder is a mortal sin. You can't, and of course, if you murder yourself, you can't. There's no chance of repentance, and so you're condemned to hell. So,
which is we don't know for sure, but we believe that completing suicide is not necessarily a reason that you're going to go to hell,
right?
Or that a person would go to hell.
And the reason we use that language is because Scripture is silent as far as specifics about that. We can draw principles from it, but that it says you will not murder anyone, that people say, well, that means don't murder yourself. That's true. The thing is what does God do with that? Well, depends on what happened before that, and even the why. And which God's word doesn't speak to. Right? Yeah. Good.
What about, I know this is in the Old Testament, that God said, thou shalt not take anyone's life, blood for blood. So how does...
It's what I just said.
That's what
I
he
mean,
was talking about. Is God?
okay.
God says life is precious. Human life is
Yeah.
precious. But who are you going to punish if you take your own life? You're going to punish the family members, and that's kind of what ends up happening. Is they get punished because they're left with this sense of guilt and shame because their loved one completed suicide, right?
Yeah.
Rather than
Can
grieving and walking alongside them and care, there's a judgment that we put on as humans.
Mm.
can you go back to bullet point 3, which is the highest rate is among 45 to 64 years of age?
Mm-hmm.
Is that because of people who no longer see any purpose in life?
Well, think about what's happening between the ages of 45 to 64.
They're done.
How
Kids
old are
are
you?
grown. That's my category. I'm not contemplating that, so don't worry.
No, but significant,
Yeah,
life changes that
retires.
happen in that.
There's a lot of
Mhm.
retiring going on.
Right.
There's a lot of.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if that's the reason for that, because again, people have gone through their biggest battle in life, and they're like worn out soldiers, and there's no other reason to exist, right? And so I'm thinking that's the rationale behind that.
It really, obviously it's speculation, but when investigations are done around it, it's usually that there has been some major traumatic event that's happened. So divorce has happened, loss of job, things that feel too big to overcome. And remember that the data says that this is males who are completing suicide more often, right? And so you take away a man's worth with, losing a job, losing a family, that kind of a thing. And those are really hard to recover from. It's not the only.
No more purpose. No more purpose in life.
Mm-hmm. Those are my thoughts.
And also, I'm also looking at the 2015. These are statistics in 2015. I think recently there's been a spike in teenage suicides, right? Especially because of like the Netflix movie that came out, correct?
13 Reasons. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about suicide and then next. But yeah, it's not as high. It still isn't. Teen suicidality has definitely increased, and there is some statistics to show that that's part of the reason. But there's some other things going on in the teen world that are adding to that.
Okay, thanks.
So where were we? Suicide survivors. So
let's just here's the thing though. Even when we take a look at the data from 2017, which is the most recent data, okay, we have white males account for 69.67% of suicide deaths in 2017. Men died by suicide at 3.54 times more often than women, and the rate of suicide is highest in middle-aged white men in particular. So again, the
not tons of shift.
Really, why white?
When you take a look at the data, and you take a look at the age range, it really hasn't budged.
Why? Yeah, that's a good question.
As a matter of fact, white male death by suicide is climbing.
Why
white male?
There's so many factors, and we do not have the time to go into all of those factors. Do some research, do a research paper, get some extra credit for it.
We'll give you a gold star.
Yeah.
Okay, just kidding. I get loopy at night. Suicide survivors. So survivors of family, spouses, friends, co-workers of somebody who has completed suicide are often severely traumatized by guilt. There's often a stigma surrounding suicide, that they may feel judgment and feel very isolated. That's very true. People do not know how to talk to people who've lost somebody in death. Then you throw in the factor that they completed suicide, And that adds absolutely further isolation, because people don't know what to say. And so there's so much guilt that the surviving family, spouses, friends have. There's a lot of magical thinking. We're talking about the magical thinking, right? So survivors really get into how, if I would have, I should have, I could have, right? They get that magical thinking. If I only would have known, right? And the reality is that most people who complete suicide are quite calm and quite content before they actually go through the act of completing suicide, because they've already made their decision. They've made peace with themselves about it in their decision. And so there's really no way for a person to know that they're going to complete suicide. Also suicide. So the stigma surrounding suicide, that they may feel judgment and feel very isolated, even if their loved one left a note. The question of why never goes away. And that is incredibly true, very consistent with people that I've talked to who've lost a loved one or someone close to suicide. We just don't understand why, right? Suicide survivors tend to, we already talked about that, wondering what they could have done, should have done, would have done differently. When dealing with someone who's lost a family member to suicide, we have to be very careful how we talk with them when it concerns, when we're talking about spiritual concerns. Like we talked about a little bit, there's a huge stigma around that. Oh, well, they must be going to hell, right? Which there's no proof of that in scripture. Huge opportunity to turn someone towards God, not away from him. I'm not going to remember the exact language, but knowing that what we know about God, being loving, compassionate, and caring, right? We know that if he has every opportunity that he has to bring a person into his kingdom, he's going to provide that. It's some of the most comforting words that you can provide someone who's struggling with that.
Being able to talk about the nature and character of God more than the act that this person, the act that they engaged in, getting the focus off of that a little bit, can be very comforting in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just the last little note on that is many families who have had to deal with suicide haven't always been treated well by Christians for some of this, thinking that has gone on for a long time. And what they say to a deeply grieving survivor can make or break their trust relationship if we don't practice sensitivity in it. So sometimes saying nothing is the best thing that you can do. I can't imagine what you're going through right now, and not giving them Christian platitudes or my brain went blank all of a sudden. Just being with them, being able to be with them, sit with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that they're not alone.
Yeah.
Because there's all kinds of confusion and uncertainty and everything, and you don't have the answers.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to be able to help them with answers. But what they need is comforting companionship.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. So let's move on to homicide. Okay. For those who've experienced a homicide, whether it's a family member, spouse, friend, or coworker, that kind of loss is highly traumatizing. The grief is often compounded by feelings of powerlessness, vulnerability, doubt, confusion, deep rage, and even a desire for revenge. The need for justice against an assailant, whether that person is known or unknown, and a deep anger toward that person can often be driving and consuming. They may feel frustration toward the police and the court or the trial process. It can take years, even if somebody is caught and prosecuted for the crime, it can take years before the trial process is even completed. And that can complicate, even delay their ability to grieve. And it can manifest as some pretty negative behaviors later on. You take a look at the after effects of terrorism events. That's murder. And when you have that personal component, if that's not dealt with, the trauma of that isn't dealt with well, the acting out can be pretty violent and pretty devastating. Witnessing a death of someone is a form of traumatic loss. Even if the person is a stranger, the experience of witnessing the death of someone, whether it's by an accident, a long illness, or a sudden death due to terrorism or natural disaster, can be very traumatizing. Remember, death is the most unnatural invasion of God's creation. And so whether it's a violent death or death from a long-term illness, death is unnatural. And so we reject it, we push back against it. And witnessing a death, a person can feel tremendous emotional shock, anger at the senselessness of it, and depending on the type of death witnessed, they can feel guilt and anger over it. They can even say, well, I should have done something, or why didn't I, or why did this happen? Why didn't somebody do something earlier? They knew this person was dangerous, all kinds of things. And so the type of death that a person witnesses can have a long-term effect on them. A lot of that is going to determine whether it was an accident, traumatic death, or death from a long illness. There may be physical, emotional behavior, and even cognitive stress reactions, and ongoing distress due to what they've witnessed. Because again, death is unnatural. It's an invasion of God's creation that made, like we see in John 11, that made Jesus extremely indignant over the fact that death had invaded his creation. Then we've got accidents, loss of life, or loss of functionality. An accidental death can cause tremendous emotional shock that can linger for a long time. Death, whether it was caused by humans or a natural disaster, can seem unbelievably random, senseless, even unfair. So it's common for a person who has been impacted by this to focus on who or what was to blame, on the countless what ifs that could have kept the loss from happening. And this can cause a person to be incredibly angry, either at a person, sometimes at God, sometimes at no target at all, because they don't know who to blame. Somebody's to blame, but I don't know who to blame. And if the accident is serious and it causes a loss of functionality, someone is now a quadriplegic, this can also cause a great grief for a person. Their way of life has changed and their whole future has changed. There's significant loss they're going to experience and have to process through, and life is different, and even thoughts of suicide can enter in at that point. And this can cause a person to go into a deep depressive state, deep agony of the soul, deep melancholy, long-term lament. It can cause them to withdraw and isolate as they try to adjust physically, mentally, emotionally. And the accident and the loss of functionality, that all has to be adjusted. So not only the accident occurring, but the cost that goes with that. All that has to be made sense of somehow. And the problem is, sometimes it makes no sense. Why did this happen? Why did this happen this way? This series of events. Why did this happen this way? And look at the cost of this. One of the hardest things, if only I did this, or if only I did that, if only this was different. Okay. That kind of idea, that kind of thinking can be extremely traumatizing. And again, one of the most traumatic experiences a person can go through is the death of a child, especially a young child, because it goes against the laws of nature. think about it. Children are supposed to outlive their parents. Parents are not supposed to outlive their children. It just flies in the face of what seems to be natural and good and right. And there's a great deal of raw emotion that can overtake a person's life for a very long time. I've done funerals for small children, even infants, 5 months old, 8 months old. And it can be so devastating, the sense of loss and the unmanageable emotions that go with it. A vast majority of couples that go through that don't survive. The marriage doesn't survive. And there's lots of reasons for that. But when a child dies, no matter how old that child is, a parent experiences multiple losses. The hopes and dreams for that child die with the child. The parent may feel that they failed in their duties to nurture and to protect. May feel enormous guilt, wishing they could have taken their child's place so the child would have lived instead of them. And then there's the multitudes of should-haves that flood a parent's mind. Or maybe the parent did something, turned away and wasn't attentive or whatever, and they take responsibility for what happened. That is a guilt and a shame that is on top of the trauma that may never leave them. And it's really, really important not to give flippant, consoling type statements during that kind of that time. And we have to remember this goes for miscarriages as well. That was a real child. Okay? And so one of the things that we advise and counsel women who've experienced miscarriage, fathers too, but especially women, is do a memorial service. What would that child's name have been? What were some of the things you'd hope for that child? Write that child a letter. Those kinds of things, to be able to understand that this is, miscarriage, stillbirth, all of that. That child still died. It was a very real child, and the grief and the loss are just as real. And the thing is that we have to remember too that there'll be fresh grieving. When the child would have started kindergarten, when the child would have, lost their first tooth, when the child would have learned to ride a bike, when the child would learn to drive or start dating or graduate high school. All those things are very real losses of what ought to have been, because death is not supposed to happen. Remember, death is normal, but not natural. Okay? And death of a child is the most unnatural death. Go ahead.
Will you speak a bit to not giving someone flippant responses? What are some examples of that?
Well, you can always have another one. You're young. Or you've got other children. Thank God you've got other children. Well, that child's with Jesus now. They're happy. You get to see them one day. None of that stuff is comforting or consoling at all. It just shows you're an idiot.
Yeah.
I don't know any other way to say that. Shut up. Please don't talk. Please don't.
Yeah, talk. I think another one that really, I had a call on Sunday. It was child loss. Child had autism, and mom was obviously beside herself in anguish, and couldn't receive from the other people in the family that she's a good mom, right? So that's one of the things that moms will do for sure. I've heard that very consistently, that there's something wrong with them as a mom that allowed this to happen, right? So
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, those are good examples.
Yeah. Or good examples of bad examples, right?
Yes, good examples of bad examples.
We talked a little bit about this, illness and severe health crisis. An illness or severe health crisis can be a traumatic loss. If an individual is diagnosed with a serious disease or medical condition, the life they've lived may no longer be possible. And as they learn to adjust to a new way of life and the changes that the diagnosis brings, the demands of adjusting can be a huge blow to someone's life. They may not know, how am I going to adjust this? How am I going to do this? You know, and it can take years of ongoing adjustment. If a person has like a degenerative disease, this is going to be a rest of your life thing that's going to continue to bring new losses with it. We don't expect that kind of stuff to happen. And depending on the person's age, these changes could affect a short amount of time, if they're really old, or a long amount of time. If you got a child that's 12 years old diagnosed with this disease, they could live to be 60, 70, 80 years old, and their health is going to deteriorate gradually over all those years. So they're going to be grieving loss of health, loss of youth, hopes and dreams for the future, relationships, things they're not going to be able to be a part of, activities that they've enjoyed that now are out of the question. There's all kinds of multiple losses. We also have to keep in mind that family members that end up moving into the role of being caretaker and protector are impacted by this too. They're going to experience grief because their life is going to dramatically change. They're going through grieving for their loved one and for themselves. So they can experience anger and sadness, disappointment. They can feel trapped. They can feel a sense of unfairness and injustice at it all. And if the diagnosis is severe, that the people who become caretakers of this person, they may have to keep what they're feeling and experience stuffed in order to care for that person. They can't let it show. And that can be exhausting and absolutely depleting mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually for them. That's why providing respite and care for caregivers is really important. Just even taking care of this puppy for a few days, it's a constant thing. When he's out of his little kennel, he's got to be watched constantly, right? And we were talking about the fact that maybe the God's, has us doing this because one of us is going to end up having to take care of the other one for a long time. And it's constant. There's no let up. There's loss and grief that the caregiver experiences as well. So we have to be careful to not presume that we know what someone is feeling when they're facing and going through these kinds of life changes.
Has there been any studies as far as the caregivers, like any depression cycles?
Oh yeah,
happening?
it's quite common because a sense of hopelessness, being trapped and hopeless, and being helpless in that can be overwhelming.
So are there laws that have been in place where it's a requirement for caregivers to be given,
No. Again, there's some of those things that you can't legislate. Some things it's common. It should be common sense, but some people don't have anybody to relieve them, or the options they have are worse than no care at all. I know people who, because they didn't have the capacity to continue to care for a loved one, that person had to go into a care facility and they died there because of lack of treatment or maltreatment or ill treatment, and the devastation that person, I should have kept them home. I never should. So there's all kinds of factors that come into play. Because remember that when someone has a severe debilitating illness, disease or injury, there's an ongoing death. Okay, the person that they were is not the person that they are anymore, the version of them they are anymore. So the person that's experiencing that and the caregiver both have to go through that. And the life that was lived, the way life was lived can't be lived the way it was. We've got natural disaster. We know what those are, but the trauma of that can become compounded, can be a compounded series of losses for multiple reasons. Natural disasters usually deal with weather, flooding, fire, hurricane, tornado, things like that, storms, volcanoes, and the losses can be multiple fold. Loss of life, family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, pets, loss of a loved one or someone close to them. It can be loss of a home, loss of everything that you own, where you live, where you work, all the memories. You don't have a job to go to, the workplace doesn't exist anymore, and then you got all the loss that comes with the financial stress that goes with not being able to work and those kinds of things. And so remember when we were talking about trauma 1 and trauma 2, people who deal with this kind of traumatic loss are dealing with compounded trauma. That's trauma 2. And they can be so overwhelmed, they don't know where to start. So remember to just be there and help them with the basics first before anything else. Do you need a blanket? Do you need a drink of water? Okay. You need a toothbrush. I mean, some real basic life survival stuff. Bringing some sense of normalcy to the grossly abnormal is one of the best things that you can do. Of course, then there's everyone's least favorite, and that's terrorism. The whole world changed on September 11, 2001, and is still in the process of change as a result of trying to understand and deal with the realities of terrorism. Those that experience what happened that day will never be the same. And terrorism is a word that up until that day referred to something that happened in other countries, not in America. But now it is part of the American experience. People who experienced the terror attack that day have had lasting effects. Many of those people have now been diagnosed with PTSD, including many of the rescue personnel, first responders who went to save people trapped in buildings. The words traumatic loss don't seem to cover loss of this magnitude. The word trauma fits, but somehow seems inadequate. It's bigger than that, but we just don't have words to express it. And for those who were there, many talked about how all of their senses were involved: sight, sound, taste, touch, feelings. All of their senses were overloaded with the sensory input and the horrors of that day. And terrorism is an act of unspeakable horror. It makes such a traumatic, what makes it such a traumatic loss is that human beings did this to other human beings. And terrorism of any kind shows our human depravity at its lowest point and its greatest point, most intense depravity. And God brings us the opportunity to show his love, compassion, and care to a hurting world in the midst of this chaos and confusion. Because people need hope in the midst of the darkness of evil. So being patient and listening to someone that has gone through an act of terrorism is one of the best ways that you can help, one of the best things you can do for them. And no matter how many times they need to talk through it, no matter how many times they need to debrief on it, they need to be able to do that. Studies have shown that talking about a traumatic event, especially when the first 48 hours after the event, is one of the best ways to overcome the fear, anger, disbelief, horror, and the rest of the powerful emotions that come as a result of that event. And the more a person talks about their experience or debriefs, the less hold the memories have on them. As they're able to talk through it, their healing can begin. And reminding them that God hasn't forgotten them and he's still in charge and still involved in their life and still with them is really important too. Well, where was God when this happened? that's not really the question they want answered. The question they want answered is, how could God let this happen? You know, they won't articulate it. Sometimes they will, but where was God when this happened? And don't give him the flip answer. Well, God was the same place he was when his son died on the cross. Please don't do that. Please don't say that. God was there, and he was with every one of those people that experienced that. In that moment, God was very personal for every single one of them. I'm convinced of that. Because that's how God is. Okay. I think this is a good place to take a break. Then we're going to come back. I'm going to let Kelly take a big chunk of the next part, because we're going to talk about common trauma effects. Okay? So we'll be back in 10.
I want to kind of loop back a little bit on that. I won't spend too much time on it, but on that, talking about an event within 48 hours or so after a traumatic event happens, that's a really important piece of preventing what we call a secondary trauma. So if we're working with somebody and they just can't talk through something that was traumatic, being able to kind of soft start it and ask them, well, what are your thoughts about that day? What are some of the first things that come to your mind about that is a really helpful way of getting kind of the floodgates to start opening, because what happens in that is they lock it away and they don't want to open up that dam. And anyway, just wanted to say that. That's one of the things that we do when we get on scene for trauma calls, is just talk and ask them, do you want to share what you saw, what occurred, and from your perspective? And it's helpful, hard, but helpful. Yep. Okay, common trauma effects, re-experiencing the trauma. So while one can never truly re-experience any past event, the unresolved thoughts, emotions, and physical responses that attend to the event can make it seem as if the event is truly not past or is so fresh that the same responses have never completely abated. So this can manifest in a number of ways. So flashbacks or intrusive memories of the trauma. They may experience flashbacks in which they intensely relive the trauma as if it was really happening again, as if they're there in that time, in that place, and they may feel all the same emotions and sensory experiences again. They don't lose consciousness during a flashback, but they may have difficulty distinguishing the here and now reality when a flashback consumes them. And Warren can probably speak more into this. He mentioned this last week about his own intrusive memory experience, but helping a person feel safe to talk about that is a really important piece of what we do. Mm-hmm. Can be very frightening for them. It can, and because of the stigma of the mental health industry, make somebody feel like if I tell somebody, then they're going to think I'm crazy. Often people are really out of touch of how trauma interacts with their physicality, their emotions, their sights, their smells.
Well, the person that I'm working with, he has a tendency to play and replay the same issues. Mm-hmm. Is that common? You've talked
the same issue or the same traumatic event. So you mean he's hashing, he's dwelling on something, or he actually
the same events, like
dwelling, hashing.
Yeah, he keeps on doing that. And so, what's the best way to do that? Like, you told me that before. Move on.
No.
Well, if it's connected to a traumatic thing, that's one piece of things I would think. But if it's something where there can be, if it's a believer, there can be unresolved unforgiveness going on in that, something that they feel they could have done.
What's the dynamics? Why would people want to rehash that? What is it? What are they trying to resolve?
It's not a matter necessarily of want, Raul. It's a matter that they get stuck there and don't know how to break it.
And so, how do you help them get out of it, or you just allow it to happen and tell them?
It depends on the circumstances.
Yeah,
that depends on what's going on. There's not a cut or dry, I don't think, answer
there's
to
so many variables going on. Without sitting down and talking to that person, there's no way to tell.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Some of it, as far as in regards to trauma goes, that does happen. You will have people that need to, Warren can tell you, I've had to rehash versions of my story, and because different things come to light and I'm realizing new pieces of it. So it took a while for me to not feel bad for having to repeat the same story over and over again, but nobody else ever wanted to hear the story before. So huge piece of ministering that he did for me was letting me just talk about the story and not making me feel like I had to apologize for needing to talk about the story again.
Well, and another interesting thing about that is the fact you're not trying to fix anything. What you're doing is you're helping them think about it.
Yes.
You're talking about, okay, so when you say that, what are the thoughts that are going through your mind? What are the emotions that you're experiencing? Okay, because there's a purpose behind this. There's a reason behind this. Helping them figure that reason out, and then what to do with that, so they don't. And you sometimes you have to ask, do you want to stay trapped in this? You know, if you don't want to stay trapped in this, we need to have some different kinds of conversations. You know.
So Kelly, when you were doing that with Warren, was it because you felt that nobody understood it, and you wanted Warren to understand it more? That, you know, at least there's one person who fully gets it. Was that the reason?
I think understanding is a component of it, but it's really about somebody not being shocked or horrified at the story I wanted to tell them, because so many people are horrified at the things that I needed to share. They don't know what to do with it, so they give you minimizing pat answers to help them feel better, but that didn't help me feel better. So helping me process was, I mean, it really is about processing. It's about letting me talk it out. And, you know, like you said, what emotions are coming up? Well, for a long time, there were no emotions because there was deadness, right? I couldn't connect to emotions. There was no, so it really is about the process.
Right. And again, it's being able to think about it and helping that person look at all the multiple facets that go with that and its effects that they're not able to see clearly.
Yeah, I'm thinking it could be like also the sense of justice in you, wanting to make sure that there's at least one witness whose story, who'll understand the story in case you die, and will carry on that fire that you already had.
Maybe.
Sometimes that might be the case, but not always.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So flashbacks. So such flashbacks are an entirely normal part of the response to trauma as they struggle to rework and integrate the experience. And that's really important language, because usually the traumatic experience that needs to be processed hasn't been integrated into their life, right? They've been experiencing it from a distance, right? Or not experiencing it at all. If they have another traumatic experience year before this one, they may even find that sudden flashbacks about that previous experience get mixed up with flashbacks about their more recent traumatic experience. And Morgan can speak more to that, but that's they're trying to sort out the things. So something has woken up in them that they realize they need to process, and they need to give it a name, and they need to figure out why it keeps coming up, right? So it will often cross over each other because, well, this feels just like that other thing. Oh, wait, this is that thing and not this thing. So it's super common. And I think we've all, seen, shows in the movie, well, how can it be that you remember this way or that way? That's super common in traumatic memory. Nightmares about the trauma or other scary content. They may have nightmares that vividly replay the traumatic event or that just replay fragments of their experience. They may have nightmares that repeatedly replay themes of helplessness, horror, anger, or other feelings related to the trauma. They may wake up very upset and sweating profusely without remembering any nightmare.
Yeah, we have to remember that there'll be things that are representative, but not actually reminiscent of the trauma. So, trying to run across a field with snakes and all of a sudden you just can't move, okay? And so that sense of powerlessness, that impending doom, and you're going to die, it's going to be horrifying, and there's no escape. That's what's being represented in the nightmare. Okay, it's representing how they felt during the traumatic event or events, but it's not reminiscent of the event. That's one of the things with nightmares, is that what is going to represent this emotion the best, and that's absolutely subjective.
So then that ties also to insomnia. Often people feel too wired to sleep, Nightmares may be so alarming that they become fearful of sleep. They may associate darkness with danger, being left alone with their own thoughts without the distractions of their daytime activities. Can prompt memories of the trauma, which make it difficult to sleep. And obviously, coffee or alcohol can interfere with their sleep like nothing before. Persistent insomnia or awakening during the night can also be a sign of developing depression, which has to be dealt with differently than the trauma itself. Yeah, talking about sleep hygiene and things that they're doing around that becomes pretty important, so that you can rule out chemical things that are going on, or food interruption, or just different things that are just basic body things, especially if their body's ready, their mind and their heart's ready to start doing some work to process things. We want to rule those things out. Intense response to reminders or symbols of the trauma. So experiencing sudden panic, irritability, anger, grief, horror, a vague sinking feeling that sometimes seems to come out of nowhere. Sometimes they may recognize at the time or later that their feelings are in response to a reminder of the trauma. One of the fresh ones that comes to my mind in that is one of the gals I'm working with who's had a pretty traumatic event where her still spouse had tried to kidnap their first baby. So now every time the baby cries, it's a trauma trigger for her. So working through that and helping her find a place to put that, and that she can turn that into nurture, but she's got this, dual thing going on where she's, being triggered every time the baby cries. So it can be very complex. Such reminders can be obvious or they can be subtle. They may also not be easy to recognize being connected with the trauma. And Warren's going to talk about this, I think, next week, right, with the PTSD. He'll go into that a whole lot. But a lot of times our bodies are responding and our mind and our heart aren't even connected to it. And we just think that's just how we are. And a lot of times people don't know to pay attention to the physical cues that are going on with them. Feeling strong feelings or emotions when they're facing a monthly or annual anniversary of the traumatic event. That's very common. And that usually will come into play, at least what I've seen, it's not always the case, but often is the season will come in and they'll, recognize the season is here, and that's a reminder of the trauma that happened, right? So smells or sights, smells, senses, all of those things are an important part of that. Survivors find that quite unpredictably that they fall apart or buckle under stressors that they would normally take in stride. That's another really important indicator that something's going on. They might find that music is intolerable, so their sensory of sound becomes really magnified. Children's behavior or noises are hard to take, right? So baby crying would be one, or, a toddler screaming, or can't watch television because of the reactions they experience. That's really common. So numbing of emotions and avoidance of triggers. Periodic numbing of emotions, although emotions may be very intense at times, at other times they may be so much the opposite that they may feel dull, empty, numb, or completely shut down. A person can also feel emotionally dead or like a robot without feelings. They may feel remarkably detached and estranged from others, and they may also feel that they can't generate feelings of love in their most treasured relationships. They can lose interest or feelings of enjoyment for their favorite pastimes, eating, or even sex. So even though others might think that they're doing better at these times compared to periods when they are intensely reliving the trauma, it may alarm people to feel so numbed and lacking in feeling. That doesn't make sense.
It has to do with the fact that I'm doing so much better.
Oh, gotcha.
Right? but I'm
Yeah, yeah.
really not feeling anything.
Right, which is a
That actually
denial.
ends up being extremely frightening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So apathy comes in. So again, this is a part of normal response to trauma, just as the iris controls the amount of light entering their eye in order to protect the retina, or as the body secretes natural anesthetic after physical injury, so does their system mobilize to protect them from being overwhelmed after trauma by numbing their feelings. So that's why getting them to talk about it and talking about the experiences and remembering it is an important part of the healing process.
Well, we also talk, especially with interpersonal trauma, we talk to them about, getting them to identify what's the legitimate emotional content of that experience.
Yeah.
What kind of emotions do you experience as you describe that, as you share that?
Mm-hmm.
Helping them connect with that legitimate emotional content is really important.
Mm-hmm. And that can be a process. I know that was a huge part of my process. Not having a sense of what was the legitimate, what did you feel like you should be feeling? Avoidance of triggers or reminders of the trauma. So given the intensity of their feelings when they're reminded of the trauma, it's only natural that they will often strive to avoid such triggers, right? And that can be a real entrapment place for people. They may also find that their memory fails them in recalling certain important aspects of the trauma. And that's usually because it's so big that they don't have a place to put it, it's where dissociation comes in. Avoidance or memory lapses can be self-protective, but if they're too persistent or too generalized, they can hinder their recovery, and that's very true. It can be a self-protective measure versus a symptom of the trauma. Desires or attempts to ignore, forget, or bury the trauma. So that's very much tied to that. They may find that they go through periods during which they strive to keep the trauma out of their thoughts and don't want to discuss it. For example, they might throw themselves into their work so that they're so busy they can't hardly stop to think. This is the opposite extreme from periods during which trauma consumes their thoughts and they desperately want to talk about it over and over. And Raul, I think that's maybe what you were talking about earlier. They may find that the harder they try to keep the thoughts of trauma out of their awareness, that they more intrude in other forms. So nightmares or periodic flashbacks, because it's very much, I'm sure you guys have heard the analogy of the beach balls, right? You can push them down and keep pushing them down, and eventually your arms are going to get tired. It's very much the same with emotional trauma healing, right? The further you push it down, the harder the beach balls are going to come exploding up, right? And your body's looking for a way out. Sense of a foreshortened future or a future catastrophe, catastrophizing things, can find that they experience either hopelessness or fatalism when they consider the future. Really hard to think about dreaming or what things could be on a more positive or encouraging space of life. They may become preoccupied with ideas that they won't retain their health, they won't have love of others, that they will die young, or their loved ones will be especially vulnerable to future catastrophe. So once the proverbial 1 in a million traumatic event has happened, it can feel like all other disasters are likely to happen to them too. Which is
it's kind of like so all the boundaries are gone now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's, again, it's another self-protective, because if they keep themselves in thinking the worst thing that can happen is still there, the potentiality of that is then they're not going to be horrified by a traumatic event in the future. So it's very self-protective. So symptoms of increased arousal, trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, difficulty deciding anything. That's a really interesting one to see show up in people, they just can't, who've gone through trauma. Sometimes having children can be traumatic. Think about young mamas, they can't, or new mamas, they can't make decisions, right? Sometimes having a baby is traumatic. Irritability, difficulty concentrating, outbursts of anger, spasms of grief, hypervigilance about safety, startle reactions, body reactions to triggers, so sweating, nausea, trembling, pain, hyperventilation, knots in their stomach. That shows up very often with children dealing with trauma. Possible effects on beliefs, attitudes, and sense of self. Depending on the nature of their traumatic experience and how it was caused, they may notice some of the following changes. The world just feels unsafe, unfair, unpredictable, and out of control. So that's that huge overwhelm, right? Sense of separation from the rest of humanity. Nobody else has experienced what I have experienced. You can't possibly know. Loss of autonomy, mobility, or freedom. And especially when they've experienced trauma with other people, right? So they need to be near other people to feel like they're in this together. Sense of betrayal, unfairness, or mistrust. Self-blame and diminished self-respect. We talk about that diminished self-respect, Warren. How does that show up?
Yeah, so this is my fault.
That's the blame.
Yeah, I'm to blame, and so I really don't deserve anything better. I deserve this to happen, and so there'll be this. They won't care for themselves. It won't matter. They'll be so self-sacrificial that they won't take care of their own basic needs. They feel guilty for that. They'll use self-deprecating language, even self-harm, even if it's only verbally self-harm.
And I'd say that would show up more often in verbal self-harm than physical.
Well, that's what I'm saying is that verbal self-harm, it's still a form of cutting, if you will.
Yes.
But it's not manifesting physically. But that's that part of that self-respect. Another thing that we see, like with incest survivors, often they'll make themselves unattractive so that no one would be attracted to them, so that can control the risk factor. So there's a lot of ways that's a good one. Self-respect can be manifested.
So then sense of degradation, humiliation, or personal weakness. So also feeling very vulnerable. Indifference, fatalism, or cynicism. So feeling very, I would say hypercritical would fall into that as well. Guilt or shame about surviving, super common. Having a text conversation with somebody right now, that's really pervasive, especially if others didn't survive, but they did, and it was a tragedy that it involved many people. Rage, thoughts of revenge, and aggressive impulses. Anger at people who have not been affected. Sadness over losses. Spiritual crisis or loss of faith.
So let's talk about some of the questions that often get asked. How can this just be in my head? Well, it's not. What research shows us is that exposure to severe trauma often results in persistent alterations in the functions of the body itself, and also in the brain. Levels of several of the neurotransmitters in the brain can be affected by trauma, and that can contribute to the symptoms. Trauma can render parts of the brain overactive, underactive, and that can contribute to the symptoms. So a disruption of sleep, it doesn't take very long for lack of sleep, for hallucinations to start. So that can contribute. Baseline level of arousal or vigilance, that even measuring the resting heart rate and the blood pressure, that can be consistently in an elevated state following trauma. Another question, how might my family be affected? When something traumatic happens to one person in a family, often everyone else in the family is also affected in some way. Different people's trauma reactions may vary considerably. um, the it may seem that some are over or underreacting. We have to be careful with that, because one person may be in a period of being emotionally numb, another person may be in a period of being hyper vigilant or hyper arousal.
Mhm.
So family members often experience changes in their entire worldview or spiritual crisis of their own, even if they didn't experience the trauma, but someone they cared about experienced the trauma, because there's that sense of justice. There may be a sense feelings of guilt, anger, or even sorrow about what happened as a result of what happened to their family member. And that sometimes can make it difficult for them to be helpful to the person who originally suffered. They'll say, well, what about me? I suffered loss too. One of the things we often find that happen when we're dealing with survivors of childhood trauma, childhood abuse, they start doing their healing work, and all of a sudden their spouse feels like they're being victimized by the abuse, because all of a sudden all this stuff is coming to the surface. The relationship is disrupted. All of those things are going on, so they can feel traumatized, experience secondary or vicarious trauma as a result of the trauma of their loved one. And why am I so upset about the responses of others? And we'll get into this when we talk about sexual assault. But unfortunately, the police, the justice system, the media, medical personnel, clergy, and others can respond to the trauma survivor in ways that compound the worst feelings that they're experiencing. We call this secondary trauma or secondary wounding. People are ignorant, patronizing, impatient, or insensitive. And their responses can leave the survivor feeling ignored, blamed, treated like a child, disregarded, marginalized, disrespected, just minimized. And even well-intentioned loved ones who care about them and are eager to see them recover may respond to them in ways that compound the horrible feelings. Sometimes they're so upset about the reactions of others that feels worse than the trauma itself, or they may become preoccupied with the secondary trauma and not even continue to work through the primary trauma. So we have to remember that sometimes people may avoid them or even blame them because they don't like to be reminded that bad things can happen unpredictably to good people. That rejection can exacerbate the already volatile negative feelings, especially guilt and shame. So kind of some concluding statement or thoughts about this. Trauma is a very real and very unfortunate reality in the human experience. There is no avoiding it. Now, the level of traumatization that a person experiences is extremely personal and extremely subjective. The trap that many people fall into is that overlay. Okay, that wouldn't affect me that way, so it shouldn't affect you that way. Please do not fall into that trap. Don't fall into that trap. Well, you don't have to understand. It's not up to you to understand. You can't figure it out because they can't figure it out. They went through it, you didn't. They can't figure out what makes you think you're going to be able to figure it out. Why is it affecting them this way? We just told you that there's so many different reasons for that. What they need is somebody to walk through that with them, help them process even the thoughts, the emotions that go with that. And one of the ways we do that, say, all right, so I want you to imagine that someone close to you, like maybe one of your children, or maybe your best friend or something, we're sitting and describing to you what you just described to me. What would you think? What would you feel about what they had experienced? Sometimes by that third person hypothetical, you can help them connect to the stuff that's been buried, numbed, ignored, deadened, whatever. And that can be part of the restorative process, the healing process. It's critical that we do not judge someone else based on how they're dealing with the trauma. Now, if we are not able to help them, we need to tell them, I'm at a loss on how to be of any real help to you, okay? I can love and support you, I can pray with you, I can pray for you, but as far as it being any real help, I'm at a loss. I'd love to help you find someone that can help you walk through this and help you heal of this. I'm just not that person. And it's not for lack of a want to, it's just I just don't have the ability. A person who's a trauma survivor would much rather hear that than you stumbling around thinking you know how to be a help when you're not. They need both. They need somebody to walk them through it, but they need somebody to be empathetic and compassionate and just sit with them sometimes. And you know what? What they experienced was traumatic and they can't make sense of it, so they're going to need to talk about it the umpteenth time. Okay. Maybe if maybe this time when I talk about it, it'll make sense. They may not say that out loud, but that's part of what's driving them. Well, maybe this time I'll be able to make sense. Maybe this time I'll spot what I could have done differently to change the outcome. Okay. So these are all things that are going on beneath the surface for trauma survivors often. So Kelly, what are your closing thoughts on this?
I think there's three, only three thoughts. One, I think one of the most powerful things to say, and I lost it.
So while you're thinking?
Okay. No, I got it. So, and I think we cover this in abuse healing, but one of the most powerful things that a trauma survivor needs when they're trying to process things, and because they feel like they should be over this already. They really do. Why does this keep coming up? What is wrong with me that this keeps bugging me, right? And I can tell you in how powerful it has been to not, to be on the receiving end of that, of not having it be impatient on the other side, and just getting a right perspective about that. But that is inadvertently what some of these other trained biblical counselors do. I've ended up with a couple people that I'm working with because they don't have any experience with trauma, working with trauma background, and they've caused harm because they've done the kind of NANC approach, right? Which is, well, this is what God's word says, and this is what you need to believe. And so they're totally removed and they have no clue what they're doing because they're causing more harm because this person's got a PTSD response, right, going on. All of their neuro, pathways and all of that, everything in their system is responding to this trauma and they're trying to make sense of it. But why can't I just trust that God is good in this, right? So having biblical truth is important, but when you insert duty and legalism into the healing place, trying to insert that into a healing place for a trauma survivor, it is almost never helpful, at least in what I've experienced. And I've experienced more people coming because they're not getting the help that they needed. What they need is to be heard. What they need is a Christ-like modeling of the woman at the well. How did he behave to her, right? So having some stories in your arsenal of how did Christ walk alongside those who were really having a hard time is really important piece, because helping them get to a place of, well, how do you think, what would God be saying if he was sitting here with you? What is your sense of that, right? Helping them vet that out for themselves. It doesn't matter what I think about that. Getting them to a place where they understand that is really important, I think.
Yeah.
One of the things that I suggested when I was dealing with that person who kept on repeating the same story over was I told him to write those things down. He never, I don't think he never actually did. But would you say that's a good suggestion, or you wouldn't even encourage it?
Yeah, we often do. We often encourage people to journal things out. And the language we use gets it from spinning around in your head down on paper will sit still, so you can actually see what else is going on. Okay?
Right.
And remember, we can make suggestions to people, but if they're not willing or able to do it, then that changes our role. That changes what we're able to do. Say, there's nothing I can do for you, because what I'm bringing to the conversation that seems helpful is not helpful to you. You're either rejecting it, not understand something is going on, but it's not helpful. So I don't know what good it is for you and I to continue to have these conversations. I don't know what it is you're hoping is the outcome of that's going to be.
Another thing too that I found that was I thought was a little bit striking was, again, this person seemed to have an overwhelming desire to give to other people. He didn't have a job, but he had some money, and he said if anybody needed money, he was willing to give. He was willing to give the money to help that person. I'm wondering, is that because you're thinking if he helps that person the good will come back to him?
Maybe, but a lot of times it's hiding behind helping, being able to say, well, if I can help someone else, maybe I could have helped myself. It's what I call vicarious repair.
Yeah, and I would say, Raul, one of those, what Warren was talking about at some point, we talked about it tonight, asking that person, if you were hearing this story and you were the friend of your sharing this, what would you say to them?
Yeah, that's good.
That's it, because it helps them get to thinking about, it helps you get to the motive of what's going on for them. If they're willing to consider it, then they'd be like, well, and that can be really powerful.
And it removes it from being between the two of you two.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, a little bit of a background also of this friend, and you might want to put it in your categories for people who would go through it, would be whistleblowers. He's a whistleblower, so his sense of justice was just shattered. Yeah. He helped, and then all went backfired to him.
Yeah, it's a good thought. One more thing, after this, you have the trauma effect checklist. It's a tool that you can use that can be very helpful. It's one you can do yourself, but it's also one that can be very helpful when you're sitting down with someone. So
it helps when they see you writing down notes, right? That you really care and you're serious about them, right?
It can, yeah. Some people see it as a distraction. Some people see it as helpful. Notes are for you more than anything, to help you keep track of stuff. Be able to go back and refresh the conversation. We talked about that, when we talked about data gathering and stuff. So we're about at the end of our time. Any other thoughts or anything on what we covered tonight?
It's a talkative bunch.
I think everybody's tired.
You're probably really tired.
Yeah, it's about midnight where you all are.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good job, Kelly.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, my goal
My
is
pledge.
eventually just to completely turn over this module. So, and maybe sit in and guest teach once in a while, but really be able to turn the module over.
Someday.